And I am delighted to welcome you to the latest edition of our Thought Leadership series. If you have questions, please submit them via the Q&A button at the bottom or top of your screen. We won't have time to answer them today, but we will post answers on our website in the coming days. I am joined today by our CEO, John Clear, to discuss this year's Giving USA report. GG&A has been a proud member of the Giving Institute for many years, and John has himself been engaged as a volunteer leader there for decades. John, I've been looking forward to our conversation, and I would love for you to explain to people how this data is gathered as a beginning.
So thank you, Suzanne. It's a pleasure to be here today, and we thought that it would be useful for us to just talk a little bit about this data, where it comes from, and to make a few points in the margins about what this data might mean for all of you as either fundraising leaders or volunteers in a variety of different programs. First, let me just be really clear. As Suzanne said, this is an extraordinary announcement. It takes place every year at this time. And the announcement is indeed that America, across the United States, we have once again hit a new ceiling of $484 billion of giving across the country. This is cash giving to not only 1.4 million registered nonprofit organizations, but all the variety of nonprofit churches and other organizations across the country. So this is indeed philanthropy that touches every corner of the country. This number and the report that accompanies it, about a 400-page report that includes probably 20 pages of detailed data about every corner of philanthropy. We're in our 40th year of publicizing this data, and the origins of Giving USA really started with an organization of philanthropic leaders that go back to the 30s in this country, the American Association of Fundraising Council, consultants to philanthropy, every corner of philanthropy in the country. Eventually, the AFRC became the Giving Institute, and the Giving Institute continues to sponsor this initiative, again, with the very expert help of the Lilly School of Endowment at Indiana University, and any number of experts and economists who support this data collection every year. It is the single largest, most focused place for collection of this kind of data in the country, and it's become, in fact, broadly utilized and heavily trusted in our sector. Now, let me say that this 484 billion, which is up approximately 4.7% from last year, is once again a new increase, a new high mark on these totals. But it goes back, frankly, 40 years to when we began to organize this in much more succinct ways, where the number started out at about 160 billion at that time, 1981. We moved from 160 billion to 484 billion in these 40 years, a compound annual growth rate each year of about 5.6%. And when we do inflation adjustments, it's a growth of about 2.7%. There are not too many initiatives in the American economy that have grown that consistently over time. It does, in fact, track what happens across 1.4 million nonprofits. And again, that doesn't count churches. Let me say, and it's important to understand this, that that 484 billion in cash just reflects a part of the total impact of the nonprofit sector in this country, which is probably close to 15% of our GDP when we count all earned and unearned revenue, all employment amongst the nonprofit sector. So this is a pretty significant sector in this country. I think there are a number of characteristics about this data which we urge you to go look at not only in the websites, but the actual published material. There are over 400 pages of narratives around what this data means in specific places. But we're talking in general, Americans giving somewhere between 1.8% and 2.2% of disposable income. That represents, frankly, somewhere between 1.7 and 2.2% of GDP each year. This past year, we were at 2.1%, not quite the level. And we'll come back to make a comment about that. But the last sort of large statement I want to make about all of this data is that 69% of this 484 billion come from individuals, another 9% from bequests. So individuals account for 78% of all the money giving. Let me make that clear. 78% of this 484 billion come from people, individuals. That indeed has gone down a bit over the 40 years as we've watched the rise of foundation giving. 40 years ago, it represented 6% of all the income received. Today, it's 18%. As we look at corporations, we've seen corporations actually decline in their giving, and we can come back and talk about that. They represent about 4% of this number. Their high point was 6%. And again, we could spend a lot of time talking about data. Suzanne and I would like to just go to a couple of comments each about what we've learned in this data and what we think the data this year is signaling. So let me turn it back over to you, Suzanne, and perhaps we can talk about some of the particular insights that each of us have identified. And of course, our challenge is always, as we look at this large scale data narrative, how do we take insights from this data and actually utilize them to understand better the work that each of you do in different kinds of nonprofits around the country? So Suzanne, let me turn it to you.
Yeah, John, as you reflected in your comments, a lot of what we talk about at GG&A and across the sector is what are the trends over those 40 years. Sometimes it's difficult to see insights or make observations that are particularly telling about a year. But I was struck by the fact that, as you said, giving as a percentage of disposable income has remained largely flat at about 2% over those 40 years. And that was true even in 2021, where Americans were saving at historic rates. Even as we had fewer things to spend our money on during the pandemic, we were not, in fact, giving more of it to charities, which stuck out to me.
So Suzanne, let me just comment on that. I've been part of AAFRC and Giving Institute now for more than 40 years. And I can tell you the longest running discussion amongst this leadership group of philanthropic workers has been this question of why we can't get this number, this percentage of dollars given by Americans above that 2.1, 2.2%. We have never been able to do it across many years after many conversations about what would in fact motivate higher levels of giving across the American economy.
Yeah, it's a related fact, I guess, is Giving USA understandably made a big point about the increase in online giving, and we see that story being told. But at the same time, the number of donors, which you might, incorrectly extrapolate from that, the number of donors has not increased. So what we see is online giving is a more frequent transaction. It has not actually broadened the base of supporters, which I think when we first saw the rise of online giving, we were hoping more people would be giving as a result.
Well, in fact, that leads to a point that I know we wanted to make. And the whole question around digital engagement and online giving has suggested that indeed it's expanding the number of givers. We don't believe it is. It has here at GG&A. We think, in fact, online structures have often enabled people to actually execute their giving decision. But as we all know from the early work of the Generosity Commission, that the Giving Institute helped establish several years ago, we are in a sharp decline of households in this country giving. In fact, from 2001 to 2015, the number of households who actually make a gift in this country declined by 11%. And that is great cause for concern. This kind of report that comes out every year sort of masks that issue. And I'll come back around and talk a little bit about the inequality of giving in a minute. But you're absolutely right, Suzanne. This whole question of online giving, while important, and it will continue to grow, it doesn't necessarily suggest that we are reaching donor households who are non-donors in ways that we couldn't before.
Yeah, I think your point earlier about being kind of stuck at that 2% of disposable income and this decrease in donors, there are some things that we were hoping would change these trends, like online giving, like access to information about charities, and they're much, much harder problems to fix than, and they're much more deeply entrenched, as you said earlier.
Yeah.
So one of the other things that stuck out to me, going back to your comment about, so what do our clients do about this, is, as you well know, I work with a lot of arts organizations, and giving to the arts was up 27.5% from 2020 to 2021. And, you know, we have to acknowledge, though, that arts organizations really curtailed their programming, of course, and particularly in the beginning of the pandemic, where they stopped programming altogether. And so with so much of this fundraising at arts organizations tied to programs, it's not surprising that they saw a decrease and then it rebounded so quickly as they reopened their doors. And I have two takeaways from that I hope our clients really think about. The first is continuing to grow the focus of the conversation around the impact on mission, and not so much about specific programming, is really critical to make sure that that philanthropic support is maintained as steadfast, even as changes in programming, changes in the economy are seen. And then the second, which you've heard us talk about a lot, is that, you know, we were really heartened by the fact that organizations really understood the impact of things like galas, for instance, on their fundraising, made them more vulnerable. I would say that while I understand the inclination to want to be together again, I'm a little disheartened at how quickly organizations have just gone back to some of those pre-pandemic activities that are in fact vulnerable and not as tied to mission, more tied to programming. And I hope arts organizations will look at these numbers, think about their long-term stability, and rethink how they're telling the story of why philanthropic support.
Yeah, and I think this gives us, we should in fact pause for a moment and certainly pause and talk about the context that we all, in fact, are experiencing this philanthropy. We've had 2 years of COVID, and it has had a set of major impacts on our economy, our way of life, and certainly our nonprofits. There's no question that any number of things have happened to drive us differently. You know, the whole issue of engagement virtually has made this world different. The challenges of racial and social justice initiatives have in fact framed our perspective. Even as we have watched the challenges on Main Street, we've watched huge increases in the wealth of high net worth individuals and activity. We've seen some very substantial corporate profits this past year, huge corporate profits, but not a corresponding increase, as substantial an increase in corporate giving. In fact, corporate giving as a percentage is down to an overall all-time low across the last 40 years, despite the fact that there were any number of corporations that stepped up to help the social challenges, help with the social challenges of COVID. So there's lots of framework. One last issue that is clearly a context is the 10.1% growth in GDP and the substantial increase in the capital markets. Capital markets over the last 20 years have influenced and aligned with giving increases because there is so much giving out of related assets in the markets. People use market assets to fund their gifts. So while we've got that context, we also have the context of the extraordinary inflation that we're beginning to realize and now is becoming, in fact, right in the middle of the news today. And that kind of inflation frightens people, slows people down in terms of their giving. And of course, market recessions have the same impact on giving. They don't stop it, but they slow it down a bit.
Yeah, John, that's a question we're getting a lot right now from clients. Over your 40 plus years with the firm, what do you tell clients is most important as they think about the possibility of economic downturn and shoring themselves up against that?
So, Suzanne, I think it's the same message that you and I, in fact, talked about 2 years ago in the early stages of COVID, which is stay the course. Don't find yourself paralyzed. The same missions that all of you, each of you serve out there are still important. And staying focused on those missions and continuing to communicate about the impact of those missions is important. There will be some of your donors who slow a bit, get hesitant, get worried about their own personal circumstances. But remember, many of these largest gifts are being given out of wealth, not being given out of day-to-day income that pay the rent. There is still an extraordinary level of activity. So as we're all frightened by this inflation initiative, much like we were frightened by COVID, we need to stay focused on why we're in the process of raising money and why we're doing it. And ultimately, that message is what comes through clearly to every donor at almost every level.
It's interesting. I was just having this conversation with a university client whose giving went down during the pandemic, and their perception, therefore, was that giving went down. And really, the difference was exactly what you just talked about, John, the confidence in asking. There was not enough asking at the major and principal gift level. They were they were also finishing a campaign simultaneously, but it was really the behavior of asking that impacted them.
There's no question, Suzanne. We saw a number of very distinguished clients actually hesitate, slow down, even as they looked around and realized that, in fact, the courage of some of their peers to simply let's change our message, but keep going. Let's be sensitive to the challenges people, all of our constituents are feeling in their lives and their businesses with their families. Let's be sensitive, but let's stay the course. And indeed, that was rewarded. We saw just extraordinary numbers in some of our client numbers this past year of those institutions that kept communicating with their constituents. So let me turn to a particularly sensitive issue in these numbers that I would not want to fail to call out because we touched on it a little bit, but I think it's important to talk about. That is the shift in the complexion of giving in this country. As we've watched the number of households who give decline, correspondingly, we've seen a number of high net worth households begin to give at extraordinary levels. In fact, the numbers are really interesting. Across the country, about 55% of American households continue to give. It's a little less than that right now. At the high net worth level, families who are at that high net worth level, and we all define that in a number of different ways, but it's very substantial. 90% of those families give, much higher than the 55% across all households. And it is those donors who in fact are giving at extraordinary levels. Frankly, in response to something Suzanne said earlier, they're being asked for those extraordinary levels. We as fundraisers are stepping up and configuring propositions that are indeed ambitious, but possible given the extraordinary wealth of some of these families. Now, this reflects, frankly, the rising inequality of wealth in this country that so many of us have talked about, and in fact has such an impact on the complexion of giving. We could spend several hours talking about this issue, but there is no question that it is these large scale gifts, these mega gifts, and you all know the families we could talk about. It's not just the Mackenzie Scotts, it's many different families that have given in extraordinarily generous ways to any number of institutions, the range across nonprofits. And so we are getting more and more money from fewer and fewer families. And that is the complexion of giving here. Again, we could talk about this a great deal. I want to put one more fact in front of you that's really interesting, and had this conversation with some economic leaders just recently. It is estimated now in the next 5 to 8 years, 80% of the wealth in this country will be owned by individuals who are 60 years old and older. This should signal a very practical reality for us as fundraisers. First, it should scream out bequests and legacies. Right. That indeed we should be focused on that issue. But frankly, just as much, a number of our high-performing clients have pivoted toward asset-based giving. In other words, not asking just for cash gifts, but being, in fact, more thoughtful about creating ways in which and enabling ways in which donors can make gifts through the assets that they hold. It is estimated that high net worth families probably have their assets spread across 15 different asset classes. The kinds of real estate gifts that we've begun to see across a number of our institutions, this really sends us a signal about what it is we should be doing. This is the long-awaited multi-trillion-dollar transfer that has been talked about from the baby boomer population. The data is incontrovertible. We should be focused in this way as we think about giving and building our fundraising programs over the coming years.
You know, it's interesting, John. I had a university client comment to me recently. For this very reason, they have stopped using the nomenclature of planned gifts and started talking about complex gifts. So that there is an understanding that this is not driven by a bequest or a charitable lead trust, that they're, in order to really help the donor accomplish what they want and what the institution needs, they're needing to really think about this in a much more holistic way.
Yeah, and this kind of solicitation and focus at these levels, as all of our listeners understand, is far more cost effective for our programs. Raising big gifts, it indeed has pushed a lot of organizations to raising 95% of their money from 5% of their donors. The numbers we used to use in the old days, 20 years ago, was 80-20. Right. So now 95-5. And it's for this reason, is that the effort exercised. Now, having said that, I also want to make sure that we all understand small gifts matter. Every gift matters, because many of these complex gifts, when you look at the history of a donor, started 30, 40, 50 years ago to that organization because they cared deeply about its values and its impact on the world. Whether it be your university or a local human service organization or a local arts organization, these gifts rarely show up by dropping from the sky. They come from engaged communities of people that we look at as our pipeline to build and sustain philanthropic support across our organizations.
Well, and you and I have both witnessed, as have many, many people on this call, in the telling of why they've made an extraordinary gift. So many donors begin by talking about their donor journey and how it started with a $10 gift out of gratitude because of the organization's impact on their life. And, you know, it is part of how the donor also sees the organization throughout their life cycle as well. So you're absolutely right. And I think that brings us back to the beginning of this conversation, where we do need to worry about the fact that donor households are decreasing. And that is a problem that is worthy of our continued attention.
I think we would be remiss not to mention just briefly one more issue, and that is, in fact, the use of mechanisms such as donor advised funds. We're seeing a huge deployment of resource there from philanthropic families that frankly haven't completely sorted out what they want to support, but indeed know they are committed at a certain level to philanthropy. We have the blessing in this country of legal structures that allow those kinds of gifts with all the accompanying deductions to allow people to build pools of money to which they begin to deploy gifts systematically. We should, in this profession, look at this as an opportunity to really understand we have philanthropically committed families in our community. Let's make the case to them to deploy those resources in the right way. Now, DAFs or donor advised funds are the subject of a lot of discussion and probably will be, in fact, once again addressed legislatively. We're going to see changes there, but I think the changes will continue to encourage this mechanism and the mechanism of community foundations and organizations as a very effective way to partner with individual donors who want advice, counsel, direction, and framework to help them give. Now, let me make one last comment before I turn it back over to Suzanne to bring us to a close. I think there have been shifts, really interesting shifts in giving across this country over the last 40 years. And I think looking at the Giving US data and what goes up on the website, what you can purchase through the book, is you will see lots of interesting insights that will help you in your various areas of philanthropy actually gain the benefit of insight and knowledge. Let me just give you one. There's been a big demonstrable shift in what people give to across this country. So 40 years ago, 58% of all the money given was given to religion and religious causes. That number has gone down every single year in the last 40 years to only 29% this year in 2021. That reflects the changes in American life, but it also reflects the reconfiguration of nonprofits. A lot of the social justice initiatives that used to be parked under religion have in fact manifested themselves in new human service initiatives, educational initiatives. But the fact is that number's gone down. And giving to education continues to rise slightly. Over the 40 years, it's gone from 10% to 14%. So we've seen an overall increase, despite the modest numbers of this past year, a decline toward education. I think we would also look at foundation support is really quite extraordinary, up from 7% a year 40 years ago to 12% this year. So in fact, there are interesting trends as we look at where Americans are deciding to give their money and why. So over to you, Suzanne.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. Obviously, there's a lot that is interesting and thought-provoking in this data. We would urge you to go to the Giving Institute website, check out, there's a lot of additional information and commentary, and to purchase the report this year in order to really be able to take advantage, as John said, of the many insights and really extraordinary data that, particularly when you look over this 40-year horizon, can be very helpful to you as you think about fundraising at your institution and setting expectations with leadership and with board members. I want to take a moment to thank John, the GG&A team that produces these webinars, and all of you for listening in. If you have questions, again, please do submit them to us via our website. We will post them in the coming days. And I'd like to invite all of you to connect with me, with John, and with the firm via LinkedIn. We appreciate your time today and look forward to lots more conversation about this interesting data. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.